There were no witnesses for the defense's case. Instead, more digital evidence of prostitution and sex trafficking surfaced, along with new audio messages from the man at the center of this federal criminal trial, Sean Diddy Combs. This is your full recap of Day 28 of the proceedings. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law & Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Let's talk about what happened in court today, Day 28. To do that, let me bring back Law & Crime's courtroom reporter Elizabeth Milner, who has been present every single day for all the testimony and developments. Elizabeth, always great to see you. Thank you so much, she replied. First, let's talk about scheduling. We learned when both sides expect to wrap up their cases, when the jury will likely get the case, and how long each side will have for their closing arguments, which in a trial this complicated is one of the most critical parts. With so many layers for the jury to process, closing arguments serve to bring everything into focus. So what did we find out? While this case is wrapping up very fast, Elizabeth began. Honestly, even I was surprised. It feels like we've reached the beginning of the end. Both parties indicated in court today that they're preparing for closing arguments to begin as early as Thursday. Each side will have about 4 hours to deliver its final message to the jury, meaning Thursday will likely be fully consumed. By those closings, factoring in lunch, the day is expected to be dedicated entirely to arguments. Therefore, we probably won't see the jury begin deliberations until Friday at the earliest. Whether or not a verdict comes that day is still uncertain, but what is certain is that we're approaching the final stretch of this trial. Now, 4 hours per side is significant. They'll likely need all of that time, but let's walk through the next steps. Once the prosecution finishes presenting its case, the defense will make what's called a Rule 29 motion. Essentially, they'll ask the judge to dismiss the charges entirely, arguing that the prosecution failed to present enough evidence for the case to even reach a jury. These motions are rarely granted, and it's unlikely to succeed here, but it's the next step. After that, we move into the defense's case. Now, early on, there was some expectation that the defense would call several witnesses. Is that still the plan? There was a lot of mixed messaging this morning, Elizabeth explained. From what I understand, the defense still plans to call maybe 1 or 2 witnesses. At one point, they had a longer list, maybe 5, but it's been whittled down significantly. It now looks like their presentation will last just a day or a day and a half. And just to clarify, Sean Combs himself likely won't take the stand. That's correct. Given the current schedule, it appears unlikely. That said, it's his choice. He could decide tomorrow to testify. His attorneys can't stop him. But with closings expected Thursday, it seems improbable. After the scheduling updates, the court returned to the testimony of a special agent from Homeland Security Investigations, a summary witness tasked with condensing the digital evidence in this case. The government appeared focused on showing a clear connection between Sean Combs, his associates, and Jane, the second alleged victim, particularly in organizing what they referred to as Wild King Nights. Their goal seemed to be placing Combs directly at the center of these operations, not just an attendee, unaware of the arrangements, but an active participant. Prosecutors argued that these events were not random, but rather locations of prostitution or worse, sex trafficking, where Combs facilitated or directed the travel and lodging for these purposes. Before we even get to the audio tapes of Combs, Jesse said, let's clarify what we learned today. There were new flight records and payments related to travel. These were discussed in relation to organizing rooms for these sexual encounters. Right, exactly, Elizabeth confirmed. There were a number of summary charts shown to the jury today, many of which we in the gallery weren't able to see. They contained sensitive information about Jane, but I took as many notes as possible. For instance, one flight chart focused on travel from September 24th to 25th, 2022. It linked Combs' residences in Los Angeles and Las Vegas and included names like Jane Combs and Paul, a known entertainer, involved in these hotel nights. Jurors saw financial records indicating $2,500 was sent to Paul, though Elizabeth couldn't record all the flight details fast enough. She confirmed their existence. Another chart showed payments made for hotel bookings between September 7th and 19th, 2023. Those included bookings at the Trump Hotel and the Whitby Hotel in New York. The individuals listed were Jane Combs, Robert, and Cabra. Jane flew from LAX to JFK, Cabra from Atlanta to Newark and back. Venmo payments totaling $1,000 were sent to Robert. Text messages also provided financial context. One from Jane to Cabra read, I'm going to check on the status of the cash. For you. There were more exhibits involving Jonathan Perez, an assistant to Combs, Jane, and Cabra. A room at the Trump Hotel Room 0508 was reserved during that same September timeframe. The payment was made using an American Express card in Combs' name. Jurors also saw that very credit card statement. Elizabeth continued. It included a $2,597.11 charge and another one for $2,490.17. to the Trump Hotel. They even showed records from Premier Travel and JetBlue flights for Jane, arranged by Jessica Ruiz. Ruiz, as Elizabeth explained, was Combs' travel agent. The flights were booked under her name and paid using an Amex card connected to Bad Boy Entertainment. There was another wire transfer, this one from Combs to Jane, that allegedly enabled her to book more travel. In another email, Elizabeth added, Robin Greenhill messaged Team Combs saying, "Hey, please send Jane $5,000. That was attached to more charts the jury saw. Those charts included services provided by Brendan Paul and Cabro Williams, additional travel agency charges, and hotel room bookings. Everything seemed aimed at illustrating one conclusion: all roads financial, logistical, and personal ed." Back to Sean Combs. The prosecution continued to outline its case, drawing clear lines between Combs and the services in question. According to Elizabeth, the government was meticulous in linking flight records to hotel stays and financial transactions, building a picture that Jane and others weren't acting independently but were part of a coordinated system overseen or facilitated by Combs. These weren't isolated events, she explained. They were planned, funded, and repeated, with Combs often footing the bill. The court then shifted to discussing day 30 of the trial, which began with widespread confusion. Social media erupted with speculation that charges against Combs had been dropped. That, however, wasn't true. What actually happened, Jesse clarified, was the government filed a letter regarding jury instructions. To prove racketeering conspiracy, they need to establish at least 2 predicate crimes. These can include arson, forced labor, kidnapping, bribery, or witness tampering. But in their letter, the government said they were removing certain instructions. Specifically, instructions about attempted kidnapping under both California and New York law, attempted arson under California law, and aiding and abetting sex trafficking were pulled. This didn't mean those crimes were off the table completely. Just those specific legal theories. There are multiple ways to prove kidnapping or arson, Jesse explained. There's the actual act, conspiracy to commit it, aiding and abetting, and attempted. They've dropped the attempted aspect, but not the core charges. Elizabeth said she was hoping for more clarification in court. But when court finally began after delays pushing the start time from noon to 3:45 p.m., the government and defense went straight into reviewing the proposed jury instructions line by line. They didn't really touch on the dropped theories. She noted, there was no layman's explanation of what it meant. Instead, the focus was entirely on the language of those instructions, particularly regarding racketeering, conspiracy, a charge that carries a potential life sentence. The arguments got technical. On page 13, the government objected to the omission of a note about co-conspirators who might not be aware of the full conspiracy but still be legally responsible. The defense pushed back, saying people like Christina Courtroom and KK didn't know enough to be part of a conspiracy. Judge Castile overruled the government's objection, suggesting that clarification could be made during closing arguments. The defense then objected to a different line, one stating actions speak louder than words, arguing that it implied circumstantial evidence was more important than direct testimony. The judge agreed to slightly revise the sentence to say, in the context of conspiracy, actions may speak louder than words. Later, the focus turned to the fourth element of RICO. The prosecution wanted the language to reflect that the defendant knowingly agreed with both knowing and unknowing co-conspirators. The defense said this confused the issue, merging the first and fourth RICO elements. Again, the judge sided with the defense. Elizabeth explained that the rest of the objections and discussions centered on how to word the instructions so the jury wouldn't be misled or confused. One proposed line suggested that a co-conspirator must serve a common purpose to be part of a criminal enterprise. The defense argued that this needed clarification to prevent the jury from assuming individual motives counted. Ultimately, the judge refused to include the proposed changes, determining that the language already captured what was needed. Jesse noted that both the prosecution and defense were framing the common purpose behind the alleged criminal enterprise differently. The prosecution wanted it broad to include assistants, security, and others who carried out the freak-offs or covered them up. The defense, however, sought tighter definitions, arguing that the government's language would make it easier to convict without sufficient evidence of shared intent. That's the heart of this charge, Jesse said. Was there a criminal agreement? Was there a group with a unified illegal goal? Or was this just chaos the government is trying to thread together? Elizabeth nodded. They even talked about who qualifies as part of the core group. The government pointed to the chief of staff, security, even Troke. The defense countered that not everyone involved shared a common goal. For example, Troke was carrying out assignments but may not have known the full picture. They then moved to discussing the predicate crimes under RICO offenses that must be proven to establish a pattern of racketeering, while arson and kidnapping dominated public conversation. Obstruction and forced labor took center stage during the hearing. On page 29 of the proposed jury instructions, The prosecution argued they weren't required to prove that there was an active federal investigation to establish obstruction. Instead, they said it was enough to show someone attempted to interfere with justice, even if they didn't know an investigation was underway. Elizabeth admitted initial confusion. It was a little vague at first, but then I realized it relates to witness Mia's testimony. After Cassie's lawsuit came out, Mia claimed that Troke contacted her, possibly to persuade her to speak positively about Combs. There were even insinuations that money could be offered. The defense argued that for obstruction to be valid, the accused must have had some idea that an investigation or proceeding existed. The government countered, saying the legal threshold was whether the communication obstructed justice, not whether the accused knew it at the time. The judge seemed to side with the government, stating that the obstruction section of the jury instructions might be adapted to reflect this nuance. As for forced labor, the defense objected to defining labor or services as including sexual services, saying it was too broad and that sex trafficking already covered that. The government cited the R. Kelly case, arguing that forced sexual acts are indeed a form of labor under the statute. They wanted the jury instructions to reflect this clearly. Judge Castile overruled the government's objection. He said he was concerned jurors might automatically equate sexual services with labor and assume the law was that straightforward. Instead, the judge opted to let each side argue their interpretations during closing arguments. Later, there were more debates. The defense objected to terms like difficult or compulsory being added to descriptions of labor. They argued those additions mimicked the prosecution's perspective and biased the language. The judge again ruled in favor of keeping the phrasing neutral and allowing both sides to clarify in their summations. Overall, the day's session was a tug-of-war over how the jury would interpret some of the most pivotal legal concepts in the trial, ones that could determine Combs' fate. The next part of the trial focused on the closing arguments, and it began with the prosecution. Assistant U.S. Attorney Christy Slavic was the one to deliver the government's summation, their last and most powerful chance to lay out their version of the truth. Before the jury began deliberations, Slavic started strong. She told jurors, over the past several weeks, you've learned about Sean Combs, about kidnapping, forced labor, arson, bribery, and behind all of it, brutal crimes, power, and violence. She emphasized that Combs never took no for an answer, and used his wealth and inner circle to commit and conceal crimes. As she spoke, jurors were shown exhibit photos. One of the most impactful was a March 2016 surveillance still from the Intercontinental Hotel. In it, Cassie is seen on the ground. After allegedly being physically assaulted by Combs, Slavic then recounted how Jane testified about being kicked, choked, and slapped by Combs in June 2024 during a so-called freak-off. These incidents may be years apart, Slavic said, but they're part of the same pattern. Then, she described how Combs had a small army of staff assistants, security guards, and associates. These people, she argued, weren't innocent bystanders. They were involved in covering up the crimes. She even referred to them as foot soldiers. This was critical to the racketeering conspiracy charge count 1. To prove this, the government must show Combs' lead or was part of a criminal enterprise with a shared purpose. Slavic pointed to texts, flight records, payment logs, and testimonies showing that this wasn't spontaneous behavior, it was organized. They got drugs, they booked rooms, they knew what was going on. She said. Dr. OCK was shown as a prime example. He once retrieved ice for Cassie's black eye. Christina Courtroom, according to testimony, coordinated logistics. These weren't just employees, they were enablers. Then came the predicate crimes. To win on RICO, prosecutors need to prove just 2 of the listed crimes. Slavic made a case for nearly all of them: forced labor, sex trafficking, bribery, drug distribution, kidnapping, and interstate prostitution. Jesse paused to reflect. Out of all these predicate crimes, he said, which ones stood out most? Elizabeth had a ready answer. Honestly, drug distribution and kidnapping. She explained that many people think of drug trafficking as kilos of cocaine or meth. That's not required. Slavic told the jury that under the law, even handing someone drugs counts. Combs didn't have to be a dealer, he just had to distribute them. The drugs listed included cocaine, meth, ketamine, oxycodone, Xanax, MDMA, GHB, TUSC, and mushrooms. According to testimony, Combs used code words like Gucci to refer to drugs stored in designer bags carried by his staff. And when it came to who received the drugs, it was a long list: Cassie, Jane, Mia, Brendan, Paul, and others. Mia testified she was forced to snort drugs blindfolded, like a guessing game. Brendan said he had to try drugs to prove loyalty. The prosecution highlighted 3 separate kidnapping incidents, each painting a chilling picture of control and coercion. First was January 2009. According to the government, Cassie was physically assaulted after she drunkenly punched Combs. Her face was stomped, and she was then allegedly forced to stay at a hotel for a week. A security guard, Bonds, reportedly told her she couldn't leave. Prosecutors said Cassie didn't consent to being held at the London hotel during that time. Then came a second incident from 2004, involving Capricorn Clark. The prosecution claimed that after jewelry went missing, Combs forced her to take a lie detector test. During that incident, the man administering the test allegedly told her that if she refused, she would be thrown in the East River. That specific threat had been mentioned in Clark's testimony earlier in the trial. The third and perhaps most infamous incident was in December 2011, and it involved rapper Kid Cudi. Clark testified that Combs pointed a gun at her, forced her into a car, and drove her to Kid Cudi's house. Why? Because he had heard rumors that Clark and Cudi were seen together. Prosecutors alleged that Clark was held at gunpoint, placed in a car by Combs and his security, including Rue, and driven to confront Cudi. She claimed she didn't want to go and was terrified during the ride. These three episodes, taken together, Jesse noted, give the jury multiple pathways to convict on the kidnapping component. Bribery came up next. Prosecutors reminded the jury of Eddie Garcia, the hotel security guard who was allegedly paid $100,000 money he split with others to turn over the surveillance video showing Combs beating Cassie at the Intercontinental Hotel. They also revisited forced labor, using the testimony of Mia Combs, former assistant. According to her account, she was sexually assaulted by Combs, and both Jane and Cassie were also compelled to perform sexual acts against their will. Prosecutors labeled these acts as coerced labor. The narrative then moved toward Jane's individual case of sex trafficking. According to Slavic, it wasn't a single moment but a staged process. First drugs and outfits, then fantasy talk, and eventually, hotel nights with other men arranged by Combs. Jane allegedly believed it would be a one-time experience to please her partner. But over time, she said she felt objectified and used. The government emphasized that Combs paid Jane's rent $10,000 monthly and used that financial control as leverage. Every time Jane said no, Slavic argued, Combs reminded her that he could take everything away. Messages from Jane were read aloud. In one, she wrote to Combs, "I feel like I'm reading my own sexual trauma." She referenced specific dates of her birthdays, where she claimed she was forced into hotel nights. The jury also heard audio messages from Combs. In one he said, "I'm not playing these games. You need to get on your job." According to the government, get on your job was code for organizing or participating in sex acts. These messages were among several played only for the jury. Screens were turned off for the public to protect Jane's identity. The prosecution emphasized that Jane had repeatedly voiced her discomfort. At the beginning, she believed these hotel nights would be rare, perhaps even exciting. But over time, she claimed they became routine and emotionally damaging. In messages shown to the jury, Jane wrote that she felt she was used solely for these encounters. One of the most striking messages read, "I feel like I'm reading my own sexual trauma on 2 of my birthdays. You forced me to perform with entertainers." In another audio recording, Jane tried to explain her feelings, only for Combs to interrupt, asking, "Are you recording me? What are you talking about?" Prosecutors argued this was an effort to flip blame or sow doubt in her mind. After Cassie filed her lawsuit, Jane's dynamic with Combs reportedly shifted. She distanced herself. But then, the government said Combs told Jane to charge him, implying financial compensation. Jane requested $100,000 per year for each year of their relationship, citing emotional harm and loss of time. The prosecution noted this was far less than what Cassie received in her settlement. Another alleged incident involved threats. Combs reportedly threatened to release Jane's sex tapes to the father of her child. Jane contacted Christina Courtroom about this, and afterwards, she did not speak with Combs for 2 months. Eventually, they reconnected near Jane's birthday in February 2024, when Combs promised a wholesome evening. That night, according to evidence, Combs arranged for an escort. The prosecution listed several other examples to support the sex trafficking charge. One was the October 2023 strip party. Jane said she wanted a drug-free hotel night, yet she became so ill she vomited between 2 escorts. Another example, June 18, 2024, when Jane was allegedly assaulted at her home and then forced into another hotel night. That night, after the incident, Combs reportedly asked her, "Is this coercion?" Prosecutors argued this phrase showed his awareness of the manipulation and further proved the case. "That goes to the knowledge element," Jesse commented. If he used the word coercion, the jury may conclude he knew what he was doing. Prosecutors underscored that consenting once or even several times doesn't equal consent every time. They said if the jury found even one instance of sex trafficking that met the legal criteria, that would be enough for a conviction. Then came Cassie's case. Slavic began this part of her closing with a dramatic pivot. Before there was Jane, there was Cassie. She laid out a timeline. Cassie was just 19 when she signed with Bad Boy. She was romantically involved with Combs. her boss, and a significantly older man. Their relationship, the prosecution argued, was filled with escalating abuse and control. They highlighted the video from the Intercontinental Hotel, which shows Cassie on the ground after being attacked. According to the government, this wasn't a one-time incident but part of a consistent pattern. They also addressed a common question: why didn't she leave? Dr. Don Hughes' expert testimony was brought in to explain the psychological complexity behind staying in abusive relationships, especially when the abuser holds power and control over nearly every aspect of the victim's life. To support Cassie's claims, the prosecution listed a series of violent incidents spanning more than a decade. The timeline painted a bleak portrait of repeated abuse. That in 2007, after a dinner, Combs allegedly attacked Cassie. In 2010, at a princess party, security reportedly had to intervene. In 2011, after discovering Cassie was sleeping with Kid Cudi, Combs allegedly assaulted her. In 2013, while she was with Mia and Deontay, he attacked her again. That same year in Jamaica, Cassie was beaten for taking too long in the bathroom. In 2015, during a party in Las Vegas, Combs allegedly beat her so severely that Troke cried after seeing the injuries. And in 2016, came the now infamous Intercontinental Hotel incident. The government also emphasized that Cassie wasn't the only one hurt. Her friends Deontay Nash, Mia, Carrie Morgan were also allegedly assaulted or intimidated. Several of them testified during this trial. Slavic further explained that Combs' inner circle played a role in keeping Cassie trapped. Christina Coram, Rubin, Roger Bonds, and Troke were all cited as examples. Troke, for instance, texted Combs updates about Cassie. "Cass is calling the studio. She's looking for you." Combs responded, "Time for the ice." Then asked, "Does her eye look better?" Troke replied that others had seen Cassie's face, and they told them a fight broke out in the club. The government tied these details directly to the Freakoffs group sex events that Cassie said were never truly consensual. While early messages from Cassie read, "I love our EFOFs when we both want them," the prosecution reminded jurors that early consent does not mean unlimited future consent. Cassie said she was pressured into these sessions even when she had a UTI, was menstruating, or simply didn't want to. She described escorts urinating in her mouth. The prosecution emphasized, "You don't need to prove every freak-off was sex trafficking, just one." Dr. Don Hughes' testimony helped anchor this. Her expert analysis explained how trauma, fear, and manipulation can alter a victim's choices causing someone to participate in acts they despise or fear, just to survive. Jesse commented, "Bringing Dr. Hughes back into the closing argument was smart. It humanized the victims and gave context to behaviors that might otherwise seem confusing." Then the prosecution turned to the next charge, transportation to engage in prostitution, covering counts 3 and 5. For Cassie, 1 for Jane. This charge, as Jesse pointed out, is among the most straightforward. The prosecution doesn't need to prove force, fraud, or coercion. They don't even need consent. They just need to show Combs facilitated travel, especially across state lines, for the purpose of sex work. For Cassie, Slavic cited a flight. On August 26, 2009, Combs coordinated with an escort named Jules. The government showed a $419 flight from LA to NYC and a $220 limo. Combs even texted Jules, "I'll tip you more if you can make it out." They also showed Combs paid for another escort, Clayton Howard, aka Dave, to fly from NYC to LAFLIGHT. Summaries, texts, and receipts were all introduced to show direct financial responsibility and intent. The prosecution wasn't finished. They moved on to count 5, transportation to engage in prostitution involving Jane. Slavic explained how Combs used Jane to organize and arrange travel for male escorts, like Cabra, who flew in from Atlanta to New York, Miami, and Los Angeles. The key, prosecutors argued, was that Jane may have booked the travel, but Combs always reimbursed her. They also revisited Jessica Ruiz, Combs' travel agent. Ruiz, according to records, handled many of the travel bookings. Though her name appeared on payment forms, the underlying funds often came from accounts connected to Bad Boy Entertainment or directly from Combs. Slavic then mentioned Paul, another entertainer used by Jane and Combs during hotel nights. She claimed Combs arranged for Paul to be flown from Los Angeles to Turks and Caicos for a private event. The government introduced evidence that Paul's travel was paid through Combs' financial channels. There was also Reggie, a male escort, flown from Las Vegas to LA. The prosecution displayed messages between Combs and Bridget, who ran Cowboys for Angels, a male escort service. In one exchange, Combs texted, "LOL damn, we don't want to have a tired situation. Feel me." Bridget replied, "Reggie is never tired." The prosecution asserted that these messages, paired with flight and payment records, formed an undeniable pattern. Combs didn't merely attend these events, he funded, organized, and directed them. Jesse commented, "That may be the cleanest charge of all. It's not about consent, it's about purpose and payment." Elizabeth agreed. The flight summary. chart was critical, she said. It gave the jury a clear timeline, a roadmap tying together the hotels, payments, and travel routes. Throughout this portion of the closing, Slavic's tone remained methodical. She reviewed each count, piece by piece, relying heavily on documents and witness testimony. While she didn't raise her voice or gesture dramatically, the content of her statements was damning. If someone walked into that courtroom for the first time, Elizabeth observed, they'd walk out thinking the government has a rock-solid case on every count. She noted, however, that Slavic's style might have lacked emotional punch. It was very monotone, very structured. She didn't really engage the jury directly until the end, when she thanked them. That might prove to be a strategic decision. In a case filled with trauma and sensational details, prosecutors may have wanted the evidence, not the delivery, to carry the weight. Still, Slavic's choice to tie in Dr. Dawn Hughes at critical points helped humanize the victims, especially Cassie and Jane. Her voice may have been calm, but her message was clear. Combs used power, wealth, and fear to control women and orchestrate crimes. With the prosecution resting, all eyes turned to the defense. Their closing argument was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following day. It would be led by Mark Agnifilo, who had 4 hours to respond. The government was also expected to deliver a rebuttal, closing a final response to whatever narrative the defense presents. As court wrapped for the day, Jesse turned to Elizabeth for insight into how Sean Combs and the jury were reacting during the prosecution's closing. Any reactions from Diddy, or from the jurors? He asked. Elizabeth said Combs mostly maintained his usual composure. There were moments when he looked toward the judge, or perhaps at the monitors displaying the exhibits. At times, he had his head down, maybe jotting notes to his attorneys, but he avoided looking directly at Christy Slavic while she spoke. However, there was one moment when his demeanor changed noticeably, when the prosecution accused him of raping Cassie in 2018. Right before their final breakup, he seemed visibly upset. Slavic read a message where he allegedly texted Cassie, "I'm sorry I raped you." At that point, Combs made a disgusted expression. Elizabeth added that she fully expects the defense to challenge that interpretation strongly during their own closing. Still, aside from that incident, Combs largely remained focused on his legal team and the evidence screens. But what seemed to affect him more than anything else? His family. Elizabeth said, when his family entered the courtroom, there was a shift in his expression. He looked relieved, emotional. Even was a pivotal day in the trial, and their presence clearly mattered to him. As for the jury, Jesse noted they had a lot to absorb. They've been shown text messages, financial logs, audio clips, witness testimonies, and now, the final framing of it all. He said, and tomorrow, they'll get the other side of the story. The defense was preparing to deliver its closing at 9 a.m., led by veteran defense attorney Mark Agnifilo. He would have 4 hours to challenge the government's case, cast doubt on the evidence, and try to reframe every disturbing narrative told by the prosecution. There was still one more move left on the government's side, a rebuttal argument. That could come immediately after the defense finishes. But the most critical phase, jury deliberation, was now just around the corner. Would the jury deliver a verdict on Friday, or would deliberations spill into the next week? Elizabeth speculated that deliberations could easily stretch beyond Friday, especially given the complexity of the charges: racketeering, conspiracy, sex, trafficking, transportation to engage in prostitution, forced labor, bribery, and more. The jury instructions alone took up dozens of pages and involved precise legal definitions. Jesse wrapped up the day's coverage. We are now in the final stretch. The prosecution has laid out what it believes is a pattern of organized, criminal behavior led by Sean Combs' acts of violence, control, and sexual exploitation. The defense will soon have their say. And then, the jury will begin deciding one of the most significant criminal trials in recent entertainment history. He turned to the audience. Thank you all for joining us on Sidebar, presented by Law & Crime. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.